Please mute yourself when you have finished speaking to prevent disruptions. At this time, I will call the special meeting to order and ask the clerk to call the roll.
Mayor Huseman,
Present.
Mayor Pro Tem Frank,
Present.
Councilmember Madera,
Present.
Councilmember Alan Thomas,
Present.
Councilmember Noble,
Present.
Councilmember Guardiola,
Present.
Councilmember Hurst,
Present.
Councilmember Grimes,
Present.
thank you, Councilmember Smith,
Present.
Mayor Huseman, you have a quorum.
Thank you, sir. And for the record, all members are present for this meeting. This time I'm looking for a motion and a second to enter into executive session of the City Council pursuant to CRS 24-6-402, parentheses 4, parentheses E, F, and G for the purpose of reviewing and discussing applications and materials related to candidates for the position of city manager, which are documents protected by the mandatory non-disclosure provision of the Colorado Open Records Act, and determining negotiating positions and instructing negotiators on matters that may be subject to negotiations concerning the contract for the city manager. Mayor Pro Tem,
So moved.
Councilmember Alan Thomas.
Second the motion.
I have a motion and a second to go into executive session. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, we will do a voice vote. Please use your physical hands in the chat window for your vote to be counted. And it looks like we are unanimous on going into executive session. The city attorney has already circulated the Zoom link for that. We will immediately adjourn from this meeting to that meeting and begin the executive session.
I'm just waiting a minute for everybody to get here. All right, so at this time, I'd like to invite Jason Rogers, Community Development Director, to make the presentation on residential and industrial. Oh, wait, sorry. I'm going to call the meeting to order at 7:17 p.m. And I would like to invite Jason Rogers, Community Development Director, to make the presentation on residential and industrial adjacency.
Good evening, everybody. Mayor, City Council, glad to be here tonight. Just checking to make sure everybody can hear me. I may be having some audio issues on my end, so if somebody just minds saying something very quickly.
We can hear you, Jason.
Okay, perfect. Mr. Roberts, do you mind bringing up the presentation, sir? Thank you. So over the past summer, City Council requested staff to provide information in regards to the interface and the adjacency conflicts between residential and industrial land uses. If we may advance the slide, Jordan. And what we have before you tonight is a presentation that we want to achieve a couple of objectives with respect to the topic and the matter at hand. One, obviously, we want to make sure that we're able to provide you a breakdown of existing and future industrial land area in the city and its residential interface. We want to be able to describe the various regulatory practices that we have taken by the city to mitigate those interface conflicts. But also we want to be able to share, I think it's always important to kind of step back, take a look at it yourself and, see what other insights or opportunities as with processes that are underway that we may be able to leverage as we continue to go forward and continue to evolve as a city. Jordan, if you don't mind. So the map that you have before you identifies, based on our research as staff, what is approved currently in the city for industrial development. Now, what that means is that as it stands, there's about 19% of all city land that is either zoned or planned for industrial development. And what's highlighted is by the red outline with the yellow crosshatch, or all of the industrial land that is highlighted within the incorporated boundaries of Commerce City. Next slide, please. This slide, staff further dug into the numbers to understand in the context of existing conditions versus what the comp plan envisions and plans at time of build out. In our existing environment, residential and commercial make up the majority of the land use at 32% each, then followed by industrial, open space, and institutional accordingly. I would also like to point out, as you can see at the bottom, with the highlight, railroad right-of-way and the Tower landfill default as industrial lands within the city, because that will be important as we kind of get further on into the slides. For the year 2035, the comp plan build out anticipates industrial to grow to a rate of 32%, with commercial land area contracting in size to about 15%, with residential remaining constant. We also see a modicum or a de minimis growth, amount of growth in open space and institutional use. Now, the question I ask is, why is that, right? And if we go to the next slide, Jordan, the rationale behind the shifting and the increase is tied really to our land use 1.2 in the comp plan. And you see it bolded and called out, which says which statistically addresses and envisions the city to maintain a ratio of jobs to housing at or above a range of 1.5 jobs per 1.0 housing units. And as we all know, in the various forms of industrial development with other non-residential commercial historically and going forward, as we had all envisioned, this was a manner and a way of achieving that primary employment, that secondary employment, and that growth basis to be able to support the necessary amenities and resources and tools for us to serve the community. Next slide, please. Now, that being said, we wanted to provide additional context as to that discussion about industrial growth and the type of industrial growth. As you can see on this slide, the majority of future industrial growth is identified in the DI North Special Planning Area along 120th east of E470 and the Piccadilly Road corridor. Now, as you all know, this area represents about 35.61 plus or minus square miles of growth. And even with this growth under the comp plan, while yes, it will include some of our traditional industrial development, warehouse and production, it is also situated strategically to locate employment, research and development, green technology, office uses as well. So this really represents a significant opportunity for us to truly diversify and to look at how we continue to meet that land use goal for balancing of jobs and housing going forward into the future. So with that context, if you don't mind, Jordan, going to the next slide. So with that context, you know, staff then wanted to further break down and understand about that 19%. How does that break down between the northern range and the core city? And in this side, what you find is that in the northern range, 18% of the total industrial land in the city is where the city is located. The majority of that industrial land is concentrated within the DeGiorgio and the East 104th Avenue, Nexus DITC or Tech Center as we call it, and Allied Waste in the northern range. This is where you start to truly see that concentration of industrial land in those areas. Next slide, please. In the core city, we find 82% of that 19% citywide, 82 of that, of the total industrial land in the city is located. The majority of industrial land is concentrated within Irondale, I-270 and Vasquez, Highway 85 corridor, and East 96th Avenue. I would like to note, and one thing to kind of bring up is that, you know, back in the 30s and 40s, when the city began to see that burgeoning industrial uses, in addition to the Rocky Mountain Arsenal emerging in these locations, we started seeing those areas start to not only, once again, look at that industrial transformation, but also the supportive residential for those that were coming and proffering those jobs that were occurring at that time, to which you find this organic nature more in the core city, as opposed to when you look at the slide in the northern range, where it's more targeted and strategic based on the comp plan and the focus of the comp plan over a number of years. Next slide, please, Jordan. Now this slide, once again, taking it back to the macro level, looking at the city, right? We talked about the industrial land and where it's mostly situated. So now focusing on the residential interface to that, right? Of that, we have 311 total residential lots or households in the city today. Of that, 1,122 or 5.8% of all residential lots are located within 300 feet. As I noted earlier in the presentation, it's worth sharing that some of the residential that you will see in the next slide happens to be located adjacent to railroad right-of-way. And the importance about that is that railroad right-of-way truly isn't the vertical construction or developable industrial that you'll find a multitude of uses of, as far as distribution centers, outdoor storage, and the like. So once again, very low threshold in ever seeing those properties turn over for some true viable development project. Next slide, please. Similar to the industrial breakdown, staff performed a similar approach for the residential. In the northern range, 38% of that 1,122 residential properties are located within 300 feet. If you look at the Bell Creek and the River Run Dunes, their interface is to railroad right-of-way as opposed to industrial land that could support vertical development. Next slide, please. In the core city, 68% of that 1,122 residential properties are located within 300 feet of industrial property. The neighborhoods of this interface are represented by Tiffany North Rose Hill, Highway 85, Corridor Irondale, and Eagle Creek. So once again, very similar context as we start to see, right, when we talk about the core city. Once again, the core city evolved organically over time with the burgeoning industrial development, with the support of residential, where with the Northern Range, it was more of a strategic and tactical approach tied back into the comp plan to ensure that we had the appropriate buffers and measures in place from a land use macro philosophical approach, as opposed to what we'll be discussing here in the next couple of slides from a regulatory practice. So to the next slide, Jordan, just hang here for a moment. I would like to kind of share, I think overall, and kind of, you know, as we were going through this process and looking at the maps as you see presented before you, I really do believe, I think overall, from a big picture land use perspective, you know, the city's done a really good job over the year and you know, the evolution of the master plan to protect and to buffer less intensive to intensive land uses as the city has grown. In the existing conditions, right, where we have found those organic development and planning of uses based on historical factors, the city is still taking and will continue to keep taking the necessary level of protections through our regulatory practices. So if we can move on to the next slide. So regulatory practices. Once again, comp plan is a framework for decisions. The Land Development Code, which me and my staff hang our hat on when evaluating projects as they come through our door, is what we use to realize the goals and strategies of the comp plan. Within the LDC, we have standards and we have guidelines for development to be used as tools in assuring that the physical appearance of the built environment provides the guidance necessary to ensure the highest possible standards of those designs. So the things that we will be covering, that we cover and what we look at, and I thought it'd be nice to kind of take you through our process when we get to that stage is, right, we look at uses, we look at bulk and dimensional standards, we then look at the entitlement process, right? What is the process that they have to follow? And then when we get to that stage of identifying the appropriate procedure, right, we then start to get down into the nuts and bolts of it with building orientation, massing, form, screening, buffering between incompatible uses, lighting design standards, performance standards, and outdoor storage. So next slide, please. So use classification or regulations really speaks to the hierarchy of how land uses are allowed or not allowed, and the procedure in which they may be approved. And you kind of look at it from a scalability from, I'll say, least intensive to most intensive. And right, when you think about permitted by right, as noted in the slide, right, uses are, right, once again, furthering the policies and the vision of the comp plan. We've identified that based on the underlying zone district and the proposed use, that they are appropriate in order to be moved forward through an administrative process, right? So what we've also then determined is that through development techniques, we can mitigate impacts at a less than significant level and allow buildings and structures and other uses on the site to be aesthetically harmonious with adjacent development and neighborhood character. I would say that this evaluation is no different if it's an industrial land use, if it's a commercial land use, if it's a residential land use. All land use to some extent in nature have impacts, and those impacts based on good planning practice, based on standards and regulations and requirements, and other policies allow us to effectively mitigate through, once again, the built form. So it all depends on the underlying end use, once again, to what extent certain impacts have to be mitigated, right? With residential, you're going to have to mitigate traffic patterns because, once again, you're adding more cars to the road. With industrial uses, it may be dust and noise. So once again, we're exploring all of these issues across the board for all of our land uses, just not particularly with one. A use by permit is, I'll say, a form of a discretionary approval, not to the same scale and magnitude of a conditional use. However, it does warrant some additional analysis for specific sites in question. Now, the reason why we add this is that we do have a handful of industrial uses that are allowed through this approval. So think as storage and distribution for fly ash, wineries, bulk grain transfer, breweries, microbreweries, as a couple of examples. Now, conditional use permits, those come before you, right? Those are true discretionary quasi-judicial matters that obviously you all receive a recommendation from Planning Commission, ultimately to take an informed action at time of a public hearing. Now, these processes are for uses that are unique or have a varying operational characteristic or development feature. I would say with conditional use permit, as it should be, there's a heightened level of scrutiny due to the potential nuisance or hazard impacts that may come from surrounding uses. For instance, putting a heavy industrial use adjacent to residential that may cause higher amounts of air pollution and or dust or noise and odor, right? We're going to want to evaluate that through the various criteria under the CUP to ensure that we're mitigating the impacts as necessary. And then obviously, there's times where you truly have an incompatible use with surrounding land uses that you do not permit at all under that zone district and or adjacent to certain uses. Next slide, please. So bulk standards. In the planning world, what we like to call bulk standards are the things in which the developers get to be able to color or paint within the lines, right? They establish a foundation for the applicant to build and own and to occupy a structure. All development in the city must meet bulk standards to utilize a site unless approved through a variance or a minor modification process. A variance goes through a board of adjustments for review and discussion, whereas a minor modification is received administratively. However, there are still approval criteria that must be met in order to demonstrate compliance with the overall intent of creating a harmonious design for a project. Now, there are a number of different types of bulk standards. Most of the key ones that we see that get realized within the built environment, the on-ground conditions, are maximum floor area, which is how big can you build that building, the maximum lot area, how big is the lot in which that building is being situated, minimum maximum setback requirements, how far is that building being pulled from the adjoining property lines to ensure that it's mitigating its visual and or orientation impacts, and minimum and maximum building heights, how tall is it going to be? Those are kind of your core kind of constructs, and when we are evaluating. Now, once again, there are a number of other bulk standards that are identified as well, but these are your main ones that you're establishing what that building is going to look like, how it's going to feel on a piece of property. Now, when you look at the various industrial zone districts and you look at the intensity from one zone district to the next with respect to incompatible land use, as you know, within the core city, we have that kind of I'll say homogeneous kind of makeup of zoning in between residential and industrial and commercial. We still want to look at the protections of that most intensive land use to that least intensive. And then by doing so, that for those that are adjacent to, once again, those lower intensive land uses, for I-1, right, you'll have a 25-foot setback. But as you go up in scale from I-1 to I-2 or I-3, you then increase that setback from a residential lot or a commercial lot. So once again, it's looking at those protections at that stage of the regulatory process. Continue on, please. Building orientation. Once again, building orientation is very key to, and some of the things that we are tasked under the Land Development Code is to ensure that there's views into the project, and that the views that we shall preserve views through buildings arranged in a manner to complement adjacent existing development. What you have up on the screen is an example of, you know, the typical building orientation and clustering that we look to try to drive development to, once again, to avoid those impersonal appearances and to maximize the human scale interface along public realms or along adjoining property lines. We use it also to be able to frame and enclose, you know, some of the more intensive aspects or ancillary intensive aspects, such as your parking areas, your public spaces, your loading docks. So even orientation of buildings and how we place them on the site can give that impression and can give that perspective of trying to mitigate and trying to still create that scale that is comparable to adjoining uses that may be less intensive, or in fact serving as a buffer between more intensive land uses versus those that are not. Next slide, please. Massing and form. I will say this in general, the industrial design has evolved pretty rapidly over the last 10 years with the focus of maximizing building coverage and flexibility. The city understands, right, with the growth of distribution centers, and as we see, right, we see more of those starting to come into our community. I've seen more and more of those come into our community, and that trend to meet that demand. However, we remain uniquely interested and due diligent in that industrial maintain and or provide a fresh aesthetic to reduce the impersonal appearance and to visually stimulate from the public realm with materials from synthetic stucco to pre-stressed concrete to precise concrete panels, brick, glass, stone. Because once again, the inclusion of architectural elements, will help to avoid, monolithic shapes and surfaces, bringing it back down to that human scale. And equally detailed facades to help with high quality materials adjacent to residential parcels is also a requirement, once again, to help to buffer. And what I mean by that is that we try to marry, what we find with adjoining residential property owner with industrial as much as we possibly can, once again, so that there's some stitching into that community. Next slide, please. Screening is another important practice for us in community development. It obviously is a way to minimize the functional views of building operations. As you'll see highlighted in these slides, you'll have what is a screen wall, which is adjacent to loading docks that are of a certain height and length, so that way those that are driving by or walking by a site don't view it on site. And then similarly, having more decorative walls along the perimeter of a piece of property that also include various materials of the site. So once again, making it look as though it is a complete design. We do this quite a bit. I think one of the things just to bring up in that slide is that also we do look at fencing and freestanding walls up to a height of 8 feet in height in certain cases, once again, to truly try to mitigate those interfaces between incompatible or less intensive land uses. Next slide, please. With respect to the buffer zones, landscaping and buffer zones, we look at mitigation through a couple of different ways. This is an exhibit from our land development code, but really digging into it, we really look at separation and screening with plant materials. So what that means is looking at planting groups of various canopy and evergreen trees to create density and to mitigate visual impacts. We look at integration of plantings, and that is looking at how you incorporate trees and plantings into the actual architectural theme of buildings and outdoor spaces that are provided on site with a development. We'll also look at the visual mitigation or integration of fences and walls. Once again, privacy walls, security walls that help to reduce unattractiveness and create aesthetically pleasing realms. We also look at establishing privacy, so that's that vertical landscape elements, the further screen windows or views into windows and out of windows from or even around outdoor spaces. And then the last but more common is landform shaping, so that's that berming, that's that grade change to alter views, to subdue sound, but also to change the sense of proximity that an individual or a property may have to that development. Next slide, please. Lighting is also another key thing that we focus on for pretty much any and all development that comes in, but particularly around with industrial development that we key in on. It's obviously receiving what are called photometric studies, and those are studies and or plans that demonstrate the location and the height of where mounted and freestanding lights are going to be, and the quantity and the type of lamp used in the luminaire or the luminance brightness of that. The focus of that is to ensure that we do not allow lighting to trespass from one site to an adjacent abutting property. So in the land development code, all lighting must be properly shielded and downward turned to prevent trespass. So what we'll find typically in a development project is that we'll get a cross section of what a lamppost or a freestanding or a mounted light fixture may be, and with the type of shielding that will be provided, and an overall site plan that would identify the luminaires that would either remain on the site or trespassing off the site, and then how they plan on reducing it to keep light on their property. The maximum height for freestanding outdoor light fixtures for development that are budding single-family residential property shall be no more than 25 as prescribed in the Land Development Code. Depending upon the use, some development may go lower, but obviously they will not go higher because of what is prohibited in the code. Once again, service and loading areas will be designed and located so that light sources cannot be seen from adjacent streets or areas with residential uses. Cutoff devices for wall mount lighting is required to contain light during situations in the service area. I would say most light that you will find that will be on a site during, I'll say, after hours operations are for security purposes to ensure that those that are visiting, personnel that is working there, are able to traverse from their place of business to their car, vice versa, in a safe manner. Next slide, please. So in addition to, I would say, the principal use, the procedures in which they're under review, the focus of design attention in standards and requirements, the city also applies what's called performance standards. These are standards that have a performance threshold requirement or expectation to be met. These standards may range from local municipal code requirements outside of the LDC, such as noise in another chapter of the municipal code, or federal and state air pollution standards for air pollution. We have 9 performance standards in the Land Development Code that the above aforementioned that you find on the slide: vibration, noise, air pollution, odor, dust, electromagnetic radiation, hazardous materials, glare and heat, materials and waste handling, apply to any and all operational land uses and or those that are legally non-conforming under the Land Development Code. So we apply these across the board to our land uses as we have, and use classification as we have within our Land Development Code that apply either for a development permit, development plan, or PUD permit, a conditional use permit, a use by permit, and so forth. Next slide, please. So once again, in addition to the principal use, we also focus design attention on ancillary supportive aspects of outdoor storage, and obviously in outdoor storage in the main as well, from a location, screening and placement, and other limitations. Obviously, the goal for us is really to focus on mitigating any nuisance impacts. So what you find on the slide here are once again, various steps that are outlined within the Land Development Code of how we're supposed to identify location, the screening and placement behind enclosed fence walls, the limitations of certain outdoor stores, right? Outdoor vehicle repair, cars and trucks is prohibited, right? The type of service it must be situated on, and what type of standards that they have to meet or demonstrate to the staff that they have to meet. And once again, very stringent site plan requirements of what they have to demonstrate to us to ensure that they have met the statutory construction of that section of the Land Development Code. Next slide, please. I thought it was prudent to add a slide about industrial PUDs. PUDs really allow for us to further specialize and craft design guidelines that are above and beyond the land development requirements. The Land Development Code requirements serve as a foundation to build on, not to deviate or to subjugate the basic expectations that we as city have crafted and created based on the various design guidelines and requirements established in the LDC. The images you see on the slide are representative designs. The developer for Legato, which has a mix of residential, industrial, commercial, mixed use, to strive to build that future industrial. Once again, trying to create a harmonious design that will be able to speak to some innovation, to some uniqueness, but also will tie into what are some of the other contemporary and very design, I'll say, positioning that they're taking throughout that entire development. Once again, trying to stitch together to make it seem as one cohesive development. At time of development or entitlement, these representative images and the associated text that is within those design guidelines will allow for staff to help curate that design to best accomplish the goals. Next slide, please. And we can go one more slide further. So as you heard me go through this presentation, right, I think we've done a pretty good job as a city, and that, you know, with the various philosophical and the macro level policy development and policy guidance from the comp plan and the implementation of those in the land development code. I will be the first one to say that doesn't mean that we can't get better and we can't learn from historically what we've seen in our community to understand and to best position how we look at land uses as we continue to go forward. And I think, you know, as we continue to go through our comp plan update, and I think through this practice that, you know, my team and I have spent over the last 3 to 4 months, right, I think there's an opportunity for us to evaluate land use controls and designations. For example, if you look at our current comp plan, we lack a true land use designation of office. I will say it's typical to find a land use classification of office because office speaks somewhat differently to your flex office or your distribution center or your green technologies and warehousing, which are, once again, evolving rapidly and changing differently than what you may find in that secondary or primary employment from that demographic. So if we want to be able to strive and continue to still hit that land use goal of 1.2 of maintaining a jobs housing balance to housing, we can still look at to diversify that land use designation and appropriately look at where those are placed so that we continue to create that balance, right? Office, industrial, residential, commercial, commercially supportive, your restaurant, your retails, so that we continue to build out. And how we look at, we build out now to 2045, not just 2035. For existing conditions where, right, the interface is unavoidable, right? The interface is unavoidable in our core city. That being said, we can continue to evaluate and set forth goals and urban design policies that will directly affect the quality of life for our impacted city residents. I think as we get a better sense of how that macro policy, you know, that 100,000 foot level from the comp plan starts to feed down into, right, how do we go about implementing that from a regulatory perspective, we can then start to really change our land development code to being able to key on and to, once again, leverage those updates to the policies and the goals for better, I'll say, interface, reduction of those conflicts, and mitigation of those various nuisances. With that, that concludes my presentation. And obviously, I'm available for any questions as well.
Thank you for that presentation. Great explanations on things. So at this time, I'd like to see if there's any questions from council. Councilwoman Noble.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. So I just want to bring us back to, first of all, thank you, Mr. Rogers, for the presentation and for responding to questions from last September. I want to bring everyone back to why we wound up having this conversation, and that's because the Bonnie View condominium complex at 104th and Highway 2 found themselves situated next to a 1.25 million square foot industrial park, Trammell Crow Industrial Park, that caught them totally off guard. They participated in a neighborhood meeting on September 2nd. And then after the shock wore off, they wrote us emails and then testified to the city council. So I was curious where residential abutted industrial and what we could do to fix the problem, so that this wouldn't arise for any other residents in Commerce City. I know in the South, so I also took the opportunity to read the comprehensive plan again, read through it, and also read the summary in particular, not the entire 372 pages in the last weekend, but the part that was pertinent, such as land use and so forth. And what are we doing, Jason, regarding light industry versus heavy industry? How do you make that designation? And I want to go back for a second and just say that it was really interesting reading the history in the comprehensive plan of 2010 also, because it talks about the fact that Adams County had a laissez-faire attitude about regulations. And that's how so many homes wound up right smack next to industrial in South Commerce City. And there might have been other decisions that would have been made had the opportunity presented itself at the time, but Adams County just wasn't thinking about that sort of thing. So anyway.
May I interject, Mr. Rogers and Mayor Pro Tem, just briefly? I don't, Councilmember Noble, you were not doing anything inappropriate, but because you brought up a specific land use case, I just wanted to make a note for all council members just to remember about that case may come before council, I believe, as a pending subdivision application. And if it somehow gets referred to the city council, I just want to make sure that as the discussion goes forward, that you avoid talking about specific developments that are in the pipeline or saying anything that could preclude you from hearing it. So, but you didn't do that, Councilmember Noble. It just popped in my head. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. It prompted this discussion. So I want to take you back, Mr. Rogers, to the slide where you showed the two discs, the round tables. There's a word for those, and I can't remember what they are.
Are you speaking in regards to?
Yeah, you were comparing land uses.
Yes, ma'am. The on slide 4. 1 minute.
Right.
On slide 4, we have what is the existing conditions versus what is.
Can you pop that up again?
Yes. If I can have some screen sharing capabilities, I will do that. Oh, there you go. Thank you, Jordan. You're on top of it. Thank you, my good man.
Okay, so my question was, how did commercial shrink on the comp plan build out? And when you talk about comp plan, which comp plan are you talking about? Are you talking about the 2010 plan, or are you envisioning something for 2021, 2022 that will have commercial as such a small portion and industrial growing suddenly to 32%?
So this is very good questions, ma'am. The comp plan build out pie, as it is of our existing 2035 comp plan. So that is the 2010 comp plan looking out to build out in 2035. Obviously, we will have an updated build out of the comp plan for our update that's going out to 2045 once we go through that process. So it's hard to say where those numbers will be, but these are the numbers as we know it today. And I would say the reason why the numbers in the future shift kind of goes to that next slide after this, which is that most of that change is going to be resultant in the DIA North area, right? Because we've identified DIA Tech Center as a major hub for employment, which is inclusive of, once again, you know, the traditional industrial uses, but also some more of those unique and innovative kind of green technology, employment, research and development, which are also still in our world in planning classified as industrial land uses. But that's where you start to see that change. And it, in that area, it doesn't really envision a significant amount of commercial as well. Hence where you see that shrinkage of commercial by adding that land that's currently unincorporated that will be annexed over time or over horizons, in which then those envisioned land uses will once again start to change that makeup in that mix. Hopefully that made sense.
So it talks about under future land use plan big ideas, maintain a balanced mix of land uses overall, i.e. residential, employment, and commercial uses to maintain the city's high quality of life, economic prosperity, and financial stability. So I'm not sure, I can understand why the balance will change because of north of the airport. But I do want to make note that in 2010, there was definitely an emphasis on quality of life and what Commerce City was going to look like. And in fact, under environmental conservation and stewardship, which we need to also, if we're going to take the land use section and make it important, then we need to make every section important as well. It says to require buffers between industrial and residential. It doesn't seem to me that a quality of life choice is 25 feet or 50 feet between an industrial building and residential with only an 8-foot fence. What can we do to enlarge the setback and add in trees? We also have expand tree preservation standards that exist in the LDC, etc. So what can we do to make it more livable around industrial uses for people who are in existing areas where industrial and residential coexist, and where new residential or new industrial is encroaching on existing residential? Mr.
Good
Rogers?
question. No, I'm thinking of your statements and your comments, man, to be able to respond accordingly to your questions. Very good questions, and I would say from there's really two bifurcated ways of how you can approach buffering from less intensive to more intensive land uses. From the comp plan, the primary way of how we look at buffering in the comp plan are the placement of land uses or certain land uses that serve as that buffering. So for instance, you may have lower intensity residential, you may then have it adjacent to it medium density residential, to high density residential, to mixed use, to commercial, to and down the line. Once again, that each respective land use based on the type of uses that are envisioned by it will create quite frankly, will create a buffer in and of itself from those uses so that they don't have those impacts. From a regulatory standpoint, given, focusing on the Northern Range and now moving to the core city, in the Northern Range, the majority of the Northern Range outside of parcels concentrated around the Giorgio site or around other nodes is mostly under a planned unit development. So most of those setbacks have already been established within those zone change that will govern and proceed even if we made a change to the land development code. Now, I will note to that is that if a PUD had make notes to that, it will rely on the requirements of I1, I2, or I3 zoning. Then obviously the LDC would influence into building orientation and layout. But if you have what I would say crafted setbacks, particularly to that development, then once again, unless you're going in every PUD in the Northern Range to identify and to address that, right, you're not going to be able to make that wholesale change from the land development code. Within the core city where we have more of our base underlying zone districts, right, your standard R1 type zoning and your R2 and R3 and your C1, C2, C3 and your I1, I2, and I3. Obviously, if it was at the behest of council, staff could evaluate, could look into, right, how you would look at adjusting the requirements of the industrial districts adjacent to those incompatible land uses with an increased setback. But I would say in order to do that, we as staff would still require some thorough evaluation and review of all of the industrial land within, and quite frankly, it's just not within the core city. That would have to be applied citywide, that we would have to understand the impacts of our direction of our, I would say, directions in adjusting any ordinance to see if it actually provides any benefits or it creates impacts elsewhere that aren't necessarily assumed today. But we would have to go through that thorough due diligence to make that assessment. But you could direct staff as a body to look at increasing setback standards adjacent to lower intensity residential land uses. I would say this, as we do go through the comp plan and as we get a better sense of what is going to be the new future land use plan, right? There may be areas where we may go from industrial to office or commercial to mixed use, whatever it might be, just to throw out a couple of scenarios and examples. That's then going to further trigger, you know, what further evaluations do we need to look at within the land development code with respect to compatible and consistent zone districts to ensure that we can then implement the comp plan effectively and appropriately over time, which then may lead to looking at our zone districts at that next level down of setbacks, building heights, use typology, and classification once we're actually through that update as well.
Well, I do think we need to look at setbacks. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Councilmember Hurst.
Hey, I thought that was a great presentation. I appreciate that, Mr. Rogers, because I can always appreciate visualized data. It just really makes it easy to understand. Again, I would be remiss if I didn't mention what I always mention. Any change like that can change current valuation of property. From a landowner perspective, it's a tough pill to swallow. Again, if you change something from commercial or industrial zoning that's currently owned, you could change the entire value of that area. And so not saying that those discussions aren't appropriate and setbacks aren't valid concerns, but like Mr. Rogers went into, I'd get concerned about trying to solve one problem and creating others. And a lot of times what I see in our land development code is flexibility, because markets change and it gives us the ability to attract, something that, a business that we may not have been thinking about in the past. And we're not constantly making land development changes because it's a lot of work and a lot of resources go into that work. The thing I think might be good for us, Mr. Rogers, is really understanding what fits in I1, I2, and C1, C2. I think a lot of us can understand what goes industrial 3, pretty intensive stuff. But I1 in my book could be a robotics facility that is extremely clean and looks like just a standard building that is pretty inviting, when you're just looking at it from an outside. And so industrial, that type of industrial, let's say like the Panasonic building off of Tower, and it has the apartment complexes over there off Tower and Pena. That started as industrial, and then there's residential right next door. And I believe that original was I1. And so Panasonic's is a battery, manufacturer in a lot of situations like that. And so they're industrial, but in reality, it's a tech job, and it's a desk tech job in a lot of situations. And so, classifying what an I1 can be could help us better determine, when we're talking about setbacks, what that might be, because I don't necessarily think that I1, it wouldn't be nice to live next to, just because it would depend on the development type, right? And so, but you start getting into the I2, I3, obviously, your setbacks need to be more significant because of the potential, not what's actually going there, but the potential of what can go there. And then, there are certain sections of our city and our growth area that only makes sense to see a ton more industrial. What's right under the flight patterns of DIA's current and future system of runways doesn't make a ton of sense to put residential, or we probably can't put residential there. But if you put transportation and warehousing under that, well, they're both noise, and so it's not as bad of a situation if you zone that out and make kind of a neighborhood of that. And so to me, it's just, really defining our understanding for, how each one could play out. Because I think, a lot of what we can do better for our constituents is explaining that. Because when I know this is not standard practice, but when I moved here, the only thing I asked the real estate agent to bring was a land development code map, because I wanted to know what was possible around where I was moving. And so, I think the better we can continue to communicate those challenges, people can look at that open field next to their house and hopefully get a vision of what's possible to move there and make a decision if the value of that house is something that they're willing to purchase based off of that, and if that location is something that they'd like to consider because of what could possibly show up there. If it's a commercial development or some type of retail option, they might not like the traffic, but also, is there residential types that fit better in those situations, such as apartment complexes, whatever that fit may be. And so I appreciate that, though, because I thought the maps did a really good job, for me at least, on understanding kind of where our challenges are at and what to expect moving forward.
And if I may, Councilmember Hurst, you actually raised something that I actually looked into just a little bit, anticipating that question might come up. In I-1 is very diverse from a use classification in our land development code. It allows eating and drinking establishments, so everything from your bar, your tavern, all the way down to a brew pub, to a restaurant with drive-through, a restaurant without a drive-through, so your sit-down restaurant, to your tasting room. It allows a variety of different offices, from business professional down to substance abuse and outpatient clinic. It allows personal service, so your instructional studios, right? Your karate studios, your coding, your place for your kids going to coding or going to learn various other kind of arts and details. And so it also allows forms of, I would say, retail as well in I-1. So once again, I-1 is a very broad ranging zone classification for uses that can be from truly a commercial nature or an industrial nature. And our bulk and dimensional standards fall within our zone districts, not our uses, unless we have special performance standards for certain uses. And we have a very exhaustive list of uses within our land development code for all types, being residential, being industrial, being commercial, you name it.
So just the final thing I had was something that I'll propose offline, because I'm not going to bore you all to death with this tonight, but hopefully one day we can get it back to discuss this and take a regional approach on this. But when you hear from not just our community, but the others that surround our northern growth area, millions of square feet of warehousing coming, and I'd like us to consider an approach similar to what we do for multifamily homes on solving some of the truck parking issues that will follow that much warehousing. There is a truck parking facility in Commerce City. We all know where that's at. There's plenty of data out there that shows that it's about 140% of capacity on a regular basis. And so, the next closest one is in Bennett. And where can we do, or Lakewood if you're going the other way. And so what can we do to recognize that the land development code doesn't force any market driven decisions to bring in some type of truck parking facility? And quite honestly, not too many people are going to allow for a truck parking facility to be built. And so how through land development code can you start focus on third party truck parking solutions, because if we don't solve for them, they will be parking in communities, because federal law dictates if you drive for 10 hours and 1 minute, you get a violation. So at 9 hours and 59 minutes, you pull over, because it's automatically recorded today on your electronic logging device that's required inside of your truck. There's no fudging paperwork like you could have fudged 3 or 4 minutes in the past. And so it's something that is top 3 issue nationwide for many communities that are impacted similar to ours. And so just something that the solution is complex, will be tough, and it needs to be a regional approach. But I just propose that because of what we see in our growth potential, we need to also start thinking of truck parking similar to to how we're concerned about parking at an apartment complex, where we want, somewhere between 1.5 to 2 parking spots per every front door at that parking or at the apartment complex. We should be considering something like 1 to 2 parking spots for every 10,000 square feet or 50,000 square feet of a warehouse. So that's not having negative impacts on our community in the future. But something I will propose more holistically offline, so we can find a time to discuss it as a council in the far off future, even if that needs to happen.
Councilmember Alan Thomas.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem, and thank you, Mr. Rogers, for the presentation tonight. I just had a couple questions on slide 22, where you said the outdoor vehicle repair cars and trucks is prohibited. Is this limited to certain types of businesses? Or if you can explain that a little more, because they already do this, especially in the core of the city. So would this be for new businesses, or is this already for current businesses as well? Okay.
My apologies. Jordan, do you mind bringing up that slide? So thank you about that.
Mhm.
So when thinking about outdoor service and repair, what we have, particularly within the land development code, right, we have a prohibition within the land development code. If someone is doing outdoor vehicle repair, obviously, if you have identified locations, I'd like to know, because then obviously they're doing it illegally. And that's something that we would have to inspect and to make sure that we're taking proper practice and protocol within code enforcement to fully enforce our land development code and our prohibitions. I'm not aware of any, but if there are some, then obviously we just need to be made aware of that.
Okay, thank you. Yes, because I believe, and I can get, with the staff and yourself, but it is a problem, and especially, like I said, in the core of the city. And then I was just concerned, like, as far as industrial properties, I'm hoping that staff, and I don't know how the mayor and the city council feels, but industrial properties, it does seem like they do need a greater buffer from residential properties, at least 1,500 to 2,000 feet. So if that, can be increased, because I get up, especially like I said, in the core of the city, there is a lot of residential homes right next to industrial areas, and they, so I hope, that can be looked into as well.
If I may ask, ma'am, when you think of 2,000 and 3,000 foot buffer, are you speaking more at the macro level with the comp plan of that 2,000, 3,000 foot, or are you looking at the micro level? And the only reason why I asked that question is that, right, we have a lot of small industrial lots where in the day's existing environment, they're only 60 feet wide, right? And so when we think about that 25 and that 50-foot setback, that is on site for building placement and location. Now, if you're talking macro level, right, given that we're going through the comp plan update, right, this is information that we can share with our consultant as we're thinking about that future land use plan, about appropriate locating of, once again, more intensive versus less intensive land uses, to ensure that, once again, we're not, right, we're creating that buffer through that land use construct versus the regulatory practice of actual on-site locations of buildings and parking and screening of such.
You confuse me now, but that's just, something I hope that, would be considered. I believe I'm talking about up, as you stated, macro level, the height up. So, yeah, so thank you.
Thank you. We'll make sure we'll make sure to share that with our consultant, Council Levine, as they're going through the comp plan update. And I would further add, Council, I mean, this is an appropriate time as we're talking about land uses at the macro level, because right, we are going through that update through the comp plan, and right, we are going through that introspection and inspection to look at how we continue to think about our evolution and our growth and the appropriate siting and location of those various land uses. So obviously I welcome, my team welcomes the thoughts and the questions that you have, because this will ultimately feed into how Council Levine then interacts with our community and then brings forward, various deliverables to try to look at that big picture.
Okay, thank you. And then one question, last question, I was curious too, does the Planning Commission get a study session on this as well? Like, since, will they get to vote on this as well?
As of the moment, given that I don't believe we're really voting on anything yet, ma'am, given that we haven't received any uniform direction from the body on outside of what we're currently doing, the comp plan update, we had not considered a study session with our planning commission. Doesn't mean that we can't have one.
Okay.
In the same sense.
Yeah, I was aware we weren't voting, but I just think it'd be nice if the Planning Commission knew a little bit of what's going on also, and maybe have a little bit of input in it as well. So thanks.
Thank you, ma'am.
Councilmember Noble.
You're muted.
Sorry, still muted. Proportional in a sense, so that a smaller lot has a less intensive use on it, is particularly if it's next to residential, and more intensive use on larger acreages could have more of a setback, because I mean, it's like doing an equation so that you could figure out the proportionality on some of this in order to create those buffers that don't exist at the moment, since the land use plan never did include those various types of uses that you explained earlier, that it could be one after another, that could be the buffer between residential and then high industrial. And my second point is, what about, and maybe more of this will come out when we have our goal setting conversations, but having our industrial buildings now start taking a look at sustainability and being more green and making better use of technology that exists in order to leave a smaller footprint. We do have a whole section in the comprehensive plan from 2010 about greenhouse gases, and nothing that I'm aware of exists in Commerce City that was not implemented from the plan in any fashion that I'm aware of, unless you know, and you can correct me. But if we had, if industrial properties were required to have wiring, for example, for electric vehicles, so that was already in place, so that they're prepared for it, how would we make those things possible? Is that something you just do on your own, or is it something that we have to vote on? How does that work, Mr. Rogers?
So to answer your first question, ma'am, very good questions. we actually removed solar regulations from our LDC to make it easier for various residents and the commercial community to actually install solar panels. That's just an example. Now, that's not the full broad spectrum of sustainability. I would say if we do not have a requirement within our municipal code or our land development code requiring some form of environmental initiative, and looking at environmental initiatives being very broad-based of just not the kind of solar or zero energy, but looking very broad spectrum across leaving a zero or a net zero footprint. If we don't have that requirement within our land development code, my staff and I cannot require any developer, industrial, commercial, or residential to do such. Now, I will say that we have tasked our environmental planner, in concert with our environmental consultant, as part of our environmental consultant contract, to perform a land development code audit of opportunities for environmental initiatives to, over time, for all types of development to be woven into that structure. So we are looking into that as we speak, and we'll be able to ramp that up once we have our environmental consultant on board to assist and to engage with us on.
Okay, and so since we're working on the LDC with regards to oil and gas operations, then I would assume that the same thing would apply, that the city council then would develop something and then add that to the land development code.
Yes, ma'am. Right.
Based upon the advice that we're getting from the consultants. And since you raised the question of the consultants, I was going to bring this up during council reports, but what is the status of that contract and when they're coming on board?
That's a great question, one that brings a smile to my face. We've been actually able to work through contractual negotiations with the consultant. They will be heard. The contract will be heard on March 1st by council to take action. Once a decision is made with respect to the scope of work and to the contract, staff will be off and running with achieving the various tasks that were presented to you in December of last year.
Okay, thank you very much.
Councilmember Hurst.
All right. So I think that's important to discuss too. I think Councilwoman Allen Thomas's the issue that she brought up about like outdoor car repair. For one thing, for us to also understand, and especially in the southern side of the city, is the difference between code in the county and code in Commerce City, because what we may enforce may be different than the next door neighbor in some situations. And I know that's not as common, where two next door neighbors may have different rules, but there are certain situations like that. And I think the county has different coding and land development expectations than we do. So aligning those, minus the kind of force annexation, is going to be tough to have uniform operations or uniform code across the board until everybody's kind of following those same rules. And so I think that might be something we need to continue to highlight, call out those specifics. If we do feel that, there's rules being broken, we need to make sure we understand what rules the county has opposed to what we have. And although I don't disagree with the idea for looking to the future and what the future holds, similar to what Councilwoman Noble said about charging stations, in overall planning training that I've been through several times now, there's something to be said about how these setbacks and kind of zoning can also create districts and neighborhoods that end up picking winners or losers in the long term. In the beginning, it has really good intent, but as they develop, you pick winners and losers just based off of geolocation, and you create districts that maybe attract one type of people with one type of, you know, some people with higher annual incomes and some people with lower. You can really start to define that on your own without any intention to do so. And so we just have to be aware that some of the decisions that we make can cause other issues significantly in the long run. They may not be apparent today, but as our city, you know, matures, those things become, and I can point several out, I'm not going to do so, but around the nation, that exactly good intent started and led to horrible situations that are currently trying to be dealt with today. And so I'm not saying we shouldn't go into that. The other side of regulatory change is it also can breed people holding on to properties and letting them go downhill longer, because as you sell the property or ask for significant upgrades, you then have to come in compliant with current land development codes. And that has stopped small business development in many situations because you just can't make those initial investments to become compliant with those codes unless you tear down the building and start fresh. I mean, it just is too cost prohibitive in those situations. And what ends up happening at times is those buildings sit vacant for longer than, you know, you'd want them to, and they end up having to be demolished and rebuilt. But that's 10 to 12 years after the local development around it has already bypassed it. And so all of these things come with balance. I think Director Rogers did a really good job talking about at the beginning how the comp plan really is striving for that balance. And, you know, we can all have input and perspective on what balance really means, because, you know, we're not going to get a perfect true balance. But I think, you know, those that have worked on this plan and I've had input and perspective to the city councils in the past have been through really intensive training on city planning, master planning, you know, and also we all understand that there wasn't as much modern city planning when our city first started. And so, you know, you're trying to combine two schools of thought together and make them more compatible. And it's never going to be fun or easy to do that because they are, you know, complete opposite sides of the spectrum when it comes to planning. You know, when you're kind of building and developing as it fits, as we did early in this city, or even before this city first started officially, you know, and then you have master plan community on the other side. It definitely does feel a disparity in planning and how the outcome comes out, because again, it's opposite sides of the spectrum when it comes to delivering that product.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Rogers? Okay, so at this time, we have a presentation on the Aeropolis Regional Committee Phase 3 work funding reappropriation request for 2021. So I'd like to invite Michelle Claymore, Economic Development Director, to make the presentation.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Jordan, if I could have you bring up the presentation, that'd be wonderful. Thank you. Well, good evening, Mayor Pro Tem and City Council members. This study session presentation was scheduled to provide City Council with some background information on the Colorado Aeropolis and marketing efforts surrounding it in response to a funding request that was made to Mayor Huseman and Councilmember Noble during the Airport Coordinating Committee, or the ACC, meeting on February 10th. Next slide, please. The presentation will include background information on the formation and the purpose of the Aeropolis Regional Committee, and I'll explain what that is, and an update on the committee's marketing projects and funding requests for the city's share of the projected costs, and how the efforts can benefit Commerce City. Next slide, please. So voters in the city and county of Denver and in Adams County approved a measure in 2005 that would amend the 1988 IGA between both jurisdictions. Now, the original IGA did not allow Denver to develop any of the property around the terminal and the runways at Denver International Airport. The 1A ballot measured when it passed, did allow Denver to develop up to 1,500 acres of airport property. In exchange for that, they made a $10 million upfront payment to Adams County communities and agreed to share future revenue on the new development. Next slide, please. Also, as part of the new agreement, a regional marketing group was formed, and the group ended up calling itself the Aeropolis Regional Committee, or ARC. And this group is working on a marketing, branding, and public relations effort aimed at attracting high-quality investment and jobs in the Aeropolis influence area. Now, this group is made up of 4 representatives, 4 from Denver and then 4 from Adams County, including a representative from Commerce City. Next slide, please. So just as extra background information, I wanted to give what the group considers a definition for Aeropolis. And this is the definition that we are using in all of our marketing materials, but it is basically a dynamic urban plan in which the layout, infrastructure, and economy are centered around an airport. Next slide. Sometimes it's easier to talk about what an Aeropolis is not. And there's been a lot of confusion around, the term Aeropolis, especially when the media picks it up and uses it in various forms. But an Aeropolis is not the airport alone. And it's not the airport city that develops right around the terminal and develops because of the operations at the airport. And it's also not a single development. So it's not a single landowner, a single municipality. It really is, the influence area around an airport. Next slide, please. So we believe that the Colorado Aeropolis will be an economic catalyst for the region and even for the state. The combination of one of the busiest airports in the United States and thousands of acres of adjacent undeveloped land makes it a prime target for investment, enhancing Colorado's attractiveness to high-quality employers who hopefully will create lots of jobs, invest in the community, and strengthen the economy around the airport. Next slide. So this is the logo that we are using, and through an RFQ process, the Aeropolis Regional Committee, or ARC, hired an international marketing firm called Ogilvy to help develop the branding, marketing, and public relations strategies for the Colorado Aeropolis. Next slide, please. Now, this work was divided into 3 phases. Phase 1 really centered around understanding the market and our competition and starting to create a roadmap for us to move forward. And then phase 2, which we just completed, centered on creating a brand of value, creating competitive differentiation, and refining our business targets. And then phase 3 will focus on our marketing plan, execution, and optimization. Next slide. So let's talk about phase 2 and what we just completed. So the deliverables for phase 2 included completion of the Colorado Aeropolis logo that we just showed, picking the branding colors, and refining the business targets for marketing outreach efforts. Next slide, please. The Colorado Aeropolis is expected to attract a wide range of industries. These are the targets that will be utilized for the marketing outreach. And I know there's several different ones. These were all picked based on different reasons. So Ogilvy really helped the group go through quite an analysis of, what existing industries are there already in the region? What are the industry trends? What do we think the jobs of the future are going to look like? Just a lot of different things. And this is how we came up with these targets. So Industry 4.0 is really kind of that next generation of technology. How is medical device manufacturing going to change? What's the new product that's going to help with innovation? What's robotics going to look like? And then same with transportation, agricultural innovations, healthcare innovations, and resource sustainability. Next slide, please. And really, this is indicative of the vision statements that will help formulate all of our marketing messaging. This was just included to show you some of the work that Ogilvy's been doing. Next slide, please. So as we move into phase 3, ARC's marketing efforts will include more account-based marketing, also known as kind of key account marketing. It is a strategic approach for business marketing based on account awareness in which an organization considers and communicates with individual prospects. So basically, instead of us just taking out an ad in Time Magazine, we are really going to target specific companies and specific industries. We're going to look at the trade shows that they attend. We're going to look at the things that they read and really target them specifically and get our message out there, as well as one-on-one outreach. Next slide. So the group is also working on a lead management process that provides a timely and streamlined response to inquiries while remaining a process that is entrusted by the entire group. Now, this model will be similar as to how the Metro Denver Economic Development Council manages leads for the entire Metro Denver area. So basically, leads will come into one central area, and we will make sure that we have representation from the Denver side and the Adams County side to facilitate a timely and relevant response to that lead, and make sure that all communities are represented equally, being able to have their properties represented as an opportunity. Next slide, please. So then we get into phase 3, and that's really focusing on fine tuning the marketing plan, actually doing the execution, and then trial by error, finding out what's working, what's not working, and then optimizing the plan. Next slide, please. And really the two main functions that we want to do is, again, engaging the prospect directly, like I talked about earlier, and engaging the stakeholders. I mean, we can't do this on our own. We don't own the property. So, the stakeholders is really working a lot with the landowners in the area, as well as elected officials, as well as community partners in what we're doing. So really just spending a lot more time engaging stakeholders. Next slide, please. And these stakeholders will become our ambassadors for the Colorado Aeropolis. We want to make sure that, if somebody's looking at the area, that no matter who they contact, whether it's the landowner, it's the municipality, it's an elected official, it's, whoever, that everybody is saying the same thing, that we've got the same message. And that's going to take a lot of work to make sure that, we're putting the information out about, what we're doing, what we're trying to accomplish, and what the benefits are. Next slide, please. And I think I've already gone over this, but this kind of specifically talks about what are the different pieces in phase 3. So as you look at the budget, that's as part of the appendix, you're going to see a lot of what this is. First it's content development. That's the first essential step for, creating the web content and the creation of the digital assets. And then we actually have to put the web platform together. They have to put the website together. They have to host it, put all the pieces in place, do the outbound marketing, and then the hopefully lead management. Hopefully that what they do is creating enough leads for us to start working with prospects. Okay, so the next slide, please. Sorry, the website will be the primary channel to drive awareness, education, and lead capture. It will communicate our story and proof points, weaving in emotional storytelling. Now, this is from Ogilvy, but that's the kind of stuff that they take us through step by step so that we're all working together to try to have a really Class A marketing campaign that will be as effective as it can be. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the slide that talks about the cost sharing. So the cost for phase 3 of the ARC marketing effort is around $1 million. It's $1,031,000. And Commerce City's share of that cost is $139,185. Now, this money was included in the 2020 budget for phase 3, but because of project delays due largely to the COVID-19 pandemic, this pushed the funding request to 2021 and is making a budget reappropriation request necessary. So in a couple weeks, you will see an ordinance that is asking for the reappropriation. Now, some of you may ask how we came up with that amount. really what the group decided to do is within the IGA agreement that was passed, the 1A agreement, there was a split in how the revenue sharing was going to happen. And Commerce City is going to receive 29% of those new revenues. So we decided to kind of keep that same formula for the expense here. And so, the Denver side has to pay 50% of that $1,031,000. And then what's left on the Adams County side is the $515,500. And then Commerce City share of that is 29%. Okay. Next slide, please. So really what I wanted to show in this slide is just the opportunity that's out there. We have one of the busiest airports in the world, right adjacent to about 12 square miles of either Commerce City or future growth boundary Commerce City in this area. I mean, that's just unheard of. There are thousands and thousands of acres ready for development. And so this map lists some of these properties. They're not all the properties in there, but this corridor really does give a lot of potential, and and it will develop. I don't know when, and how, but it will develop. What we're trying to do with the Aeropolis marketing is have it develop in a way that really identifies targets that we want to see in the corridor. So it tries to influence the type of development in the corridor and the type of users. Next slide, please. And so, in conclusion, the Aeropolis marketing, branding, and public relations effort is really a regional effort aimed at attracting high quality investment and jobs in the Aeropolis influence area. And Commerce City is getting great value for the work being done by Ogilvy as a small share of the cost, and will help inform the comp plan and ED strategic plan updates. So we really think that by being part of this process, that our share of the money for phase 3 really is going to go a long way for Commerce City. Next slide, please. And so I ran through that fairly quickly, but I'm available to answer any questions that anybody has at this time.
Does anyone on council have questions at this time? Oh, Councilman Hurst.
The update, I think this is important, but I also feel like this is a very important year for this group. It's just a personal opinion. I'm not speaking for everybody else, but I think it's been a couple of years and there really is opportunity and growth and connection opportunities that have now begun to pop up, one of which is very important. We began to make moves on the other side of E470. And so that's huge for us. But I also think from Aurora's perspective and everybody else's part of this discussion, would love to see continued movement on this. And so, we're putting money into this every year. Obviously, I think this year and next year are really important because of the transitions in the market, what fits in that area, so on and so forth. So I'm continuing to be supportive of this. And I think my one question, and I think Michelle, you and I have had basic conversations about this at a very high level, but I would love to see if Aeropolis boundaries make more sense to grow a little bit when taking into consideration the spaceport and everything else that can be considered for an overall kind of recognized commercial zone. I think obviously residential fits inside of that and needs to be zoned properly and everything else, but there's a much more bigger holistic approach that I think we could be marketing as a region, Adams County, with partnership of Denver and parts of Arapahoe County. And so again, I think a lot of what Councilwoman Noble was talking about could be addressed as part of that as well. You can't just, in my opinion, you can't just take a singular approach at, kind of addressing climate change issues and electrification of the transportation system with just Commerce City, because if our competitors, which I hate calling it that because they're more like our regional partners, but if Brighton and Adams County and Aurora aren't doing that, now that's looked at as a disadvantage to development because it's an additional cost. Some companies, it won't be. They'll come here because of that, and I love that. But at the same time, you're just trying to balance cost and marketing and everything else. I would love if we found a way to regionally say, if you want to come to Adams County, you got to play by these rules, and all of us do something like that. And I don't mind being the leader in that, but I would love for us to, I don't mind be first to do that, but I would love for us to take a regional approach and have discussions about that, because I don't think we're the only one looking to do that by any means. And so I think there's appetite for that regionally. And if we did it that way, it'd be a really good systematic approach to fixing some of those issues.
Good points. Mhm.
Councilmember Alan Thomas.
Thank you, Ms. Claymore, for the presentation tonight. But I was just confused on slide 21, where it mentioned the 12 square miles of the city. I was just confused. Does that mean that we would give that 12 square miles away for the project?
No, it just means that if you physically, I mean, if you look at a map and you just count the square miles, you can count 12 around the western edge and the northern edge that are either in Commerce City or in the growth boundaries. I mean, that's huge. I mean, how many municipalities out in the world have that much square footage available for development next to such a big economic engine like Denver International Airport? It's an amazing opportunity.
Okay, great. Yes, thank you. And how long has the group been in place in Denver? The Aeropolis?
The regional Aeropolis, or the Aeropolis regional group, started meeting in 2018 on a regular basis.
Okay, thank you. And do they have they started building any infrastructures yet?
Well, it's not about building infrastructure. Each of the municipalities in Adams County itself are still doing their own development. What this is really just a regional planning effort for the marketing piece of it. So we're all trying to work together to market the Aeropolis area and bring interest in development into the region.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you for answering all of that.
Sure.
Does anybody else have questions for Ms. Claymore? Okay, seeing none, we'll now go to the Legato Intergovernmental Agreement Terms discussion. I'd like to invite Interim City Manager Roger Tinklenberg to introduce the topic.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Good evening, Council. Wanted to just give a few introductory remarks here about Legato. We've discussed the Legato project several times in the past, and wanted to tie together several concepts that are involved here. One is that when we entered into the agreements with Cowley for Third Creek West, we agreed to provide financing for extending utilities east of E470, and that would be for the first time. And we would use the two general improvement districts to do that. And if you recall, that was estimated to be in the $13 to $14 million cost range. I'll have an update for you a little later this evening under my report talking about that funding package. But part of the improvements that are being made in conjunction with Third Creek West will also assist the land for development that is part of this entire district. And so, entire development, I should say, actually. And so there's an interplay. And the reason I bring that up is that we are putting into place basically terms of agreement with the Legato owners, property owners, which tie into an extension of the water facilities that are needed for what's called Pressure Zone 41. And that is the entire area up in that area where Legato is located, all the way over to Nob Hill, if you're familiar with that, which is on the east side of E470, east of the landfill. So it's a large area that has to be served by a new pressure zone. And that's where we're anticipating issuing bonds by the ECA GID in 2026. And that'll be in the $30 to $31 million range. So all of these elements tie in together, and what you're seeing are the first, well, they're actually baby steps with the ECA GAD issuing or entering into a loan agreement for Third Creek West. Then that allows additional development to occur, which allows a bigger bond issue in 2026. So again, baby steps leading to bigger steps, allowing larger development opportunities to occur in that area east of E470. So I'll turn it over to Jenna and she can give the presentation, and we're both available to answer questions if you have any. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Roger, and good evening, Mayor Pro Tem and City Council. Give me 1 minute here to start my screen share. All right, the purpose of tonight's presentation is to discuss the proposed terms for the IGA between the city's E470 general improvement districts, the water districts, and Legato. In doing so, we will also review the development area and request council's feedback on the terms that we currently have drafted. The Legato development has been included in your monthly development report packet since it was conceptualized, so I will just provide a very quick overview of the project, but if anyone does have questions, I will be happy to answer them at the end of the presentation. Also, the developer's representative, Mr. Brad Burns, will be available to answer your questions afterwards. Before we start, I would also like to note that the complete draft of the proposed IGA terms can be found in your packet. So the property is located at the northeast corner of East 88th Avenue and Tower Road and is bisected by E470. The west side is called Legato and is approximately 600 acres, while the east side is approximately 500 acres. Here is a vicinity map of the property. As you can see, it is located in the portion of our city that has yet to be developed. As such, this is a big project for the city and it will involve quite a bit of infrastructure work. This is why an IGA with 3 different entities is required. So let's talk about the goals of our IGA. Essentially, the overarching element will be to determine the financing and construction responsibilities for the trunk infrastructure necessary to serve the Legato development, as well as the other portions of Pressure Zone 41. As such, the amount of infrastructure required will be costly. The city will be able to comment on Legato's plan for debt issuance for this project, and I'd like to note that staff will bring the developer's proposal to you in a future meeting. Legato's goal is to begin construction on the infrastructure in June, which staff does believe is feasible. However, all involved entities will need to split that infrastructure work in order to get all of the necessary facilities constructed by 2024. The exception to this timeline is the irrigation line, which will be constructed later. Let's go ahead and review the details of that infrastructure work. The full design work for the project is anticipated to cost up to $5 million. The trunk line is also anticipated to cost $5 million. The pump station and associated reservoir are anticipated to cost around $30 million. And that before mentioned irrigation line will cost about $40.1 million, but that is not needed until 2058. Together, these facilities will serve the Legato development as well as a number of other developments in the area. So how exactly will the cost for all of this work be split? The current IGA terms call for the water district to act more as a project manager, but they will advance the costs for payment of design and construction of the pump station and its associated reservoir. Legato will be responsible for the design work, fronting the funds for all trunk infrastructure, and will ultimately reimburse the water district for their advanced payments. The ECA GID will front the $6.7 million for the sanitary sewer line, water lines, and portions of roadway construction. Then both the ECA GID and ERA GID will enter into a reimbursement agreement with Legato, which of course would be separate from this IGA. Finally, the two GIDs will issue bonds around 2026, as Roger mentioned, in an approximate amount of $30 million to reimburse Legato for portions of the trunk infrastructure cost that will benefit all of those surrounding developments inside Pressure Zone 41. Let's go ahead and look at a more specific breakdown of the project responsibilities. According to the current draft term sheet, the water district will be responsible for creating the master plan design work for the entire irrigation system, the contract and construction management for the irrigation system, the design, contract, and construction management for the pump station, and the review of Legato's design and construction of transmission lines and water and sewer mains. Legato's off-site facility responsibilities will include the design of water and sewer mains, the contract and construction management for transmission lines and water sewer mains, and entering into a facilities funding agreement with South Adams Water District for advanced payment of the design and construction of pump station and that associated reservoir. As previously discussed with council and also as Roger so graciously brought up, the Third Creek West developer will be responsible for constructing the sanitary sewer line from the north, as well as water lines from the west. However, our ECA GID will front the cost for this construction and will also earn interest. Both GIDs will enter into that reimbursement agreement with Legato. And again, those bonds will be issued in 2026 for the trunk infrastructure. Now, I know that was a lot of information that we went over pretty quickly, but again, the terms are laid out in your packet, and I'm happy to revisit any of them. We've gone through a lot of negotiations with Legato and the Water District, but staff definitely wants to hear council's feedback on the current distribution of responsibility, as well as financing and the overall draft term sheet that was included in your packet. Once council approves the terms as drafted or provides staff with feedback on if we should renegotiate any of the terms presented, we can absolutely draft a full IGA for you to review at an upcoming meeting. So I'll go ahead and exit my screen share. And if you would like me to revisit any of the slides, I'm happy to. But at this time, Roger, Mr. Burns, and myself are all available to answer any questions. Thank you.
At this time, are there any questions from council? Councilmember Noble.
Thank you. A lot of work has gone into this. I appreciate that. There's a portion that I don't completely understand about this process, though. So there will be bonds, and the bonds are sold on the bond market, obviously, right? But how do they get paid? Who's paying them in order for the bondholders to reap any money from this?
Sure, happy to answer that question. So the ECA GID currently has in excess of $21 million worth of assessed value. And that's due to the developments that have occurred in the DIA Tech Center and Nexus North, those developments. And that is existing assessed value. And so the mill levy that is imposed by the ECA GID generates the revenue to start paying off the bonds, or in this case, actually, we're starting with a loan, bank loan, that will be amortized over 30 years. However, it will have a balloon payment in 5 years, and that's so that we can refinance that loan, pay off that loan, and incorporate that in with the larger bond issue of 30 to 31 million in 2026. So in 5 years, we'll have that balloon payment at the same time that we would issue new bonds. And we anticipate being able to issue new bonds because there's additional construction development going on. For example, that $21 million does not include the 1 million square foot distribution facility that just started construction. It does not include the Amazon distribution building that also just started construction. And so what I did was developed basically an absorption schedule that anticipates additional construction that will occur. And that was done prior to these two large facilities even being built or conceived. And so, right now I'm fairly optimistic that it will have more capacity than what I projected out to be able to be there in 2026. So it is the property that is located within that ECA GID district that will pay the revenue, pays the taxes, that retires the debt. And so when Legato develops, it will join, the residential portion will join the residential GID, so the ERA GID. The commercial will join the ECA GID, which is the commercial area general improvement district. And so as property develops, and there's additional property that's underway and will be joining one of the two GIDs as appropriate coming up as well. And that includes Third Creek West. It includes, I can never get the names right, but I think it's Settlers Crossing. No, Second Creek Farm development the residential portion will join the residential general improvement district. So as each property develops, it joins the appropriate general improvement district, either the commercial one or the residential one. And so the beneficiaries of those improvements being financed by these two general improvement districts are the properties that pay the mill levy for those two districts, either one or the other, not both combined. And that's how we're able to issue additional bonds over time to pay for these improvements.
I saw a number of other projects listed that were grouped together that are all in Ward 4. Some of them exist already, such as Reunion. Does this mean that the residents who already are here will be paying more on their property taxes in order to fund this project?
Absolutely not. The existing property that's within the NIGID, which is the Northern Infrastructure General Improvement District, pay the mill levy only of the Northern Infrastructure General Improvement District. And that mill levy was reduced last year, if I recall correctly, or the year before, from 27 mills down to 20 mills. So they've already seen a benefit of the development that has occurred within the boundaries of the NIGID. And that's why we formed these two new general improvement districts, because it is only the properties that will join those two districts which will pay the taxes for those improvements that they're benefiting from.
Thank you. I think I might understand this go around.
Okay.
I appreciate it. It's complicated. So I'm not sure I'm qualified to even suggest that you need to change the IGA. So thank you for all the hard work that went into this. And I'm sure that you did right by the city and the new residents too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember Ellen Thomas.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the presentations tonight. But I'm just confused too. I don't understand. Can you explain like how the irrigation line, like we talked about that on slide 6, would be needed by 2058, and then you said it's 4.1 million. Can you just explain, will they be starting it as soon as the construction starts, and is the 40.1 million today's value, or will that be the value in 2058?
I don't have the answer to the second question. Maybe Jenna does, but the irrigation line is a second line. And so what they're doing in the new growth areas, they're installing a water main for domestic use, for indoor consumption, and then also installing an irrigation main, which will provide water for irrigating the landscaping and that type of thing. What they do is they initially put in the domestic line, which serves both indoor use and irrigation. And it's only later, when there's enough demand for irrigation water, that they then go back with and install the irrigation line, so that it's a dual system. And the eventual goal, obviously, is to pump untreated water through the irrigation main versus the treated water that will be used for domestic consumption. And Jenna, do you know the answer on whether those were future dollars or today's dollars?
I would be happy to address that. So while I am not 100% certain, I can let you know that the water district produced that estimate for us, and I would anticipate that they were looking at the 2058 costs, just since this is, what they do for their living. They want to be as accurate as possible. So I'm happy to double check with them, but with some level of confidence, I can say that's the future prediction.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Hurst.
Yeah, thank you. I agree as well. A lot of work's gone into this, and I appreciate that, because it does look well done. There was a portion that I would just ask that we get a little more definition behind. It's like access fees. Can you just explain to me what that means? Because that has several definitions in my head.
Go ahead, Jenna.
I am not sure where I discussed access fees. I
I think I heard something on access usage fees. That just triggered I wrote it down. Maybe I wrote it down wrong, but that triggered my, what does that mean? What are the details on that? So if I was wrong, I apologize, but.
No, I'm trying to think of what I could have said that sounded similar, but I did not discuss access fees. So I do apologize, Councilmember Hurst.
No, that's
address
my
that.
No, there's a lot of discussion. I could have been thinking, because I was thinking about some of the stuff that is already being considered and worked on at the landfill, and we've had discussions here about that.
Sure.
And so I was just trying to figure out how all that stuff works into it. And it sounds like it's obviously all being considered, and so I can appreciate that. Roger, can you do me a favor? Can you discuss, and this is just for clarification of my understanding, and maybe it's good to continue to remind us of this. When we talk about bonding, taking bond issuance on infrastructure, can you talk about whose responsibility that is, and say a more traditional approach that doesn't use metropolitan districts and these types of general districts that we utilize here in Commerce City and other parts of Colorado? Who would have that responsibility? How is that kind of funded in other situations that aren't using this type? And just so we understand or can relate to what we would be on the hook for otherwise.
Sure. Early in my career, I worked in 2 other states, and as I recall, neither of them had provisions for metro districts, or at least they were not commonly used in those 2 states. And so what happened instead is that a city would issue either basically bonds that are backed by the full faith and credit of the city, which meant property tax, sales tax, any revenue that came in. And they also did use some limited revenue bonds, but what that implied then, or what that meant, is that everyone in the city, whether they benefited from it or not, paid that tax and paid for those improvements. And so the use of a metro district, again, narrows down the benefit and, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. It narrows down the burden of paying for the improvement to those who benefit from that improvement. And so the metro district pays for improvements that are within that metro district or directly benefit that metro district. And so the people benefiting then are paying the tax, paying the mill levy to pay off that debt that was issued for those improvements. And what that means then for the city in general is that other people in other areas of the city, other taxpayers, are not paying for that cost of that improvement. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thoroughly. And honestly, that was a great kind of high level but condensed answer that I was really looking for, because I just think it's important to remind not just this group, but anybody who watches this, that metropolitan districts are always going to be a hot topic item. I don't disagree with that at all, because there's fluctuation in the way that they are actually implemented and delivered, and, you know, and so there's always going to be some misunderstanding about that. But what I want everybody to understand is we're talking about a lot of money when we start talking about these GIDs. And, you know, minus metro districts, we'd be on the hook for that. And when in the past, you know, growth was voted for and voted that it must pay for itself, this is to me the only feasible solution for us moving forward. And so there's positive and negatives, can at times be a double-edged sword, I'm sure. But this is what makes the growth possible in our city. And so that's why, you know, start off by appreciating the amount of work to try to balance this burden without kind of, first of all, scaring away new potential home buyers or scaring away new potential businesses. All of that becomes part of that challenge. And so, you know, it's to me just a very fair way to look at development and growth is the value of your property is tied to that as well. And so, you know, people will say, oh, well, in this commercial district, not only, you know, do the benefits of that residential, it benefits everybody in the city, but those commercial properties are valued based off of what's there. And so to me, it all just almost makes too much sense, you know, when you're in these situations where you have different stages of growth in your city, where the side that was developed first, doesn't matter how long ago it was developed, doesn't necessarily want to have to pay for the growth. And you know, in some situations that's short-sighted. You know, people want to slam the door behind them after they move somewhere. That doesn't always work out, and you minus a lot of opportunity at that point. But this one I think is well thought out, and I really like the approach that you guys have taken on this, on being transparent and making sure that it's a shared cost. I can't say it's more than in past situations, but it really seems like there's a focus. So I really appreciate that.
Are there any more questions from council? Okay. So it sounds like, Jenna, you could start moving forward with that.
Perfect. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll be back with a complete IGA as soon as we can.
Okay. So now we'll move to reports. So we can start with interim city manager, Roger Tinklenberg.
Thank you, ma'am. I need to get back to my report since I was opening other documents to answer some of the earlier questions. Sorry about that. It's taking me a minute here to get back to it. Okay. Just wanted to give you some general updates. For example, in terms of personnel updates, We have made an offer and individual has accepted the job to become our new chief building official. And he's planning to start work on April 12th. So I want to give you that update. Also, we had our new development review manager, Chris Hodel. He started working on the 16th, so this past Tuesday. And we have a new capital improvement project manager, Mike McGoldrick. He started today. So those are three key positions. Wanted to let you know that we're successful in finding individuals to take those jobs. And then in terms of remote work, when COVID-19 hit, all employees who could work remotely were sent home and began working remotely. We had to purchase some laptops because not everyone had laptop computers at that time. But that was part of the cost that was allocated to the federal funds that came, the CARES Act funds that came through the county. And at that time, supervisors worked out, expectations and basically what were the conditions of working at home. And that was done on an employee by employee basis or by work group. And so, there's been some variation in that. Some of that variation is appropriate and some, you look at and think, okay, we need to start standardizing some of those things. And so for reasons of productivity and retention of employees, because that will become a competitive measure in terms of people being able to work remotely. We are going to be looking at basically what is the nature of work in the future, and that will result in basically consolidating and making more formal those expectations that are set out for employees, and also document permanent protocols and rules and that type of thing. So just wanted to let you know that, we're thinking about all of that and starting work on formalizing those type of things, because that will become basically a competitiveness issue between us and other employers. Streetlights. There was a question raised about streetlights. Generally, the responsibility of checking on streetlights and repairing those that are out is the responsibility of the electric service provider, the utility that provides the electricity to those streetlights. However, there are some exceptions, and some of the lights, for example, pedestrian lighting that you see in Bell Creek, for an example, that's the responsibility of the Metro District. And so it can vary depending on the area. But to make this long story short, we're having one of our inspectors go out and check in the evening, check for streetlights that are out. And again, your eyes on the street can help us identify those as well. And so if you would turn those into a net when you spot those, that would be helpful, because then we can contact the utility and ask them to repair those. Wanted to let you know that I and several staff members had an initial meeting with Adams 14 staff regarding the possible training programs and facility that we're planning for the Mile Greyhound Park redevelopment area. That northwest corner of that property is set aside for educational institutional use. And so our initial meeting with the superintendent and some of the staff in charge of their career education program was very, very positive and productive. And we have a follow-up meeting that's scheduled to, to discuss that further, and that will occur next week. But it also opened up a broader conversation about a larger educational technical training type of program, and their facility needs in that area, and possible ways where we can serve as a go-between and a catalyst for getting something like that going as well. So very positive meeting, and as things gel and we start to define what that looks like, we'll bring back reports to you on that. But just wanted to report it was a very positive initial meeting. And then I had promised you earlier regarding the ECA GID financing. The initial discussions with the Cowley Group regarding Third Creek West was that the ECA GID would issue about $7 million worth of bonds or loans, enter into a loan for some of those utility extensions and street improvements. And the ERA GID, the residential, would enter into a loan agreement with Cowley's for about $6.7 million that they would advance, and the ERA GID would repay over time. Well, because the development that has occurred between that conversation and today, that has occurred within the ECA GID, the ECA GID is in a position to issue all of that as a bank loan, and therefore, instead of the ERA GID needing to enter into a loan agreement to repay Cowley, because they would front that money as an advance, and then the ERA GID would repay it as residential development occurs within their overall development. Instead, the ECA GID can issue all of that by entering into a loan agreement, a bank loan. And then what we would do is instead set up an agreement between the ERA GID and the ECA GID. And so the ERA GID will repay the ECA GID for the loan that it enters into. So it'd be a lower interest rate for the ERA GID and actually earn some interest for the ECA GID in the process. And so just wanted to let you know that that's the way we'll structure it instead. That way there doesn't have to be a loan from the Cowley Group. And so that RFP went out to the banks, and we've been getting strong interest, or I should say actually the underwriter, if you call it that. This is Lacey Knowles with DA Davison. She's making the arrangements, and she issued the RFP. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we anticipate that bank loan will have a balloon payment that will be due in 5 years, even though the payments will be made on a 30-year maturity. So you're making loans as if it's a 30-year loan. However, we'll have a balloon payment at year 5, and so that way, that money or that obligation can be wrapped in with the bonds that we'll issue in 2026 for that $30 to $31 million obligation at that time. So just wanted to let you know that's all in process, and so far that's been going well. So any questions on any items that I mentioned? Okay, seeing none, thank you.
All right, looks like no question. Oh, Councilmember Hurst.
Oh, sorry. There's a couple different, you know what, Roger, I'm just gonna go ahead and give you a call about a couple things, because none of it is like a big deal or anything. I just wanted to get some clarification, but I'll look into, there's a couple things that I need to probably be better versed on before I even ask the appropriate question. So we're good. Thank you.
Sure. Happy to answer at any time.
Okay. Are there any other council members wishing to make reports? Councilmember Noble.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask a question since Mr. Tecklenburg brought up the various building department folks who had been hired. I was noticing that there were residents who were having issues getting their inspections, and I wondered if those are isolated, or have we solved this problem now, or what I could report back to folks.
So the simple answer is we've been experiencing some staff vacancies, and the chief building official is the most key one of those. And we also had a significant amount of turnover in the permit technician positions. And so we've experienced difficulty there for a while in getting basically the certificate of occupancy issued on completed buildings, residential buildings. That was a problem at the end of 2020, and we've been able to solve that with refilling those positions, those permit technician positions. But it's sheer workload and staff turnover that have caused those problems. And so Director Rogers has been analyzing the data, looking at trends, and he's been talking to me about some positions that he believes we need to add. And so that's a point of discussion, and we'll be bringing some basically recommendations to you when we get into the reappropriation process. So Director Rogers, is there anything else you wanted to add?
Thank you, Interim City Manager Tinglenberg. In addition to what he stated, ma'am, I am aware of the various Facebook posts with respect to receiving remote video inspections. We are addressing the issue. It does seem to be an isolated matter during the time period of high turnover. So we are and have addressed and will be addressing to make sure that we don't have those voids in the process go forward. But yes, aware, and we are addressing the most recent Facebook post that occurred over the weekend.
Okay, great, because just communicating with the public is probably the best approach, so that they understand that it's running a little bit behind, and why. Probably saves a lot of heartache and agita for people.
I would agree, ma'am. And just so that you're aware, we are also working with community relations on trying to get information out on where they can find various self-help and or self-assistance and tools reporting out on various information on our website. So we are working with community relations on that effect as well.
Thanks.
Councilmember Hurst.
Yeah, just a quick report. Met on Friday. Sorry, I was trying to figure out what day it was. Met on Friday with landowner / developer for an area 112th and E470. There's really, no decision, just discussion about E470's work plan over the next couple of years. And that's why I think the questions were directed at me. And then their plan for development and how kind of access off of E470 could potentially be accelerated. And it was more of a information sharing idea session. So there was no, nothing to bring back to you guys on, new development or anything like that. They were really trying to understand what hurdles they have moving forward. And I obviously only told them what I know, and couldn't, there was no promises to be made or anything like that. So just wanted to make sure that I reported to you guys that there's interest there still. There's, potential development coming soon, I guess, is a relative term. I'm not sure what that means, but it's coming sooner rather than later. So did want to just report out that just had a real basic meeting, 1 hour meeting with them, and high level discussions.
Are there any other council members wishing to make reports? Okay, seeing no other requests, we are adjourning the meeting at 9:30 p.m. Bye, have a good night.